Welcome to the Deep Dive. Talk Testimonies listeners. Joining us for a really interesting Supreme Court case today.
Yeah.
Washington State Department of Licensing versus Cougar Den Inc.
That's right.
And this one really gets at like a very fundamental question, which is, where is the line between a state's power to tax and the federal government's obligation to uphold treaty promises to sovereign nations?
Absolutely.
And so we're going to start by kind of giving you the outcome of this case, and then we'll really break down how the arguments went and what the justices were thinking and all that, so that, at the end of this deep dive, you'll have a really good sense of what happened in this case and what the key takeaways are.
Right. And this case really centered on a dispute over Washington State's tax on motor vehicle fuel that was being brought into the state by Cougar Den Inc., which is an entity that is connected to the Yakima Nation. And the state was trying to apply this fuel tax to them.
So right to the big question here for Talk Testimonies listeners.
Yeah.
Who won?
Ultimately, the Supreme Court sided with Cougar Den.
Okay.
They affirmed the judgment of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals.
Okay.
And they basically said that Washington State's fuel tax, as it was applied to Cougar Den's transportation of fuel that was intended for sale on the Yakima reservation, violated the Yakima Nation's treaty rights.
So big win for Cougar Den.
Yeah, big win for Cougar Den.
So let's back it up a little bit. What even brought this case to the Supreme Court? Like, what's the backstory?
Yeah, so the real core of this is the Treaty of 1855 between the United States and the Yakima Nation. And this treaty has this really crucial provision in it that guaranteed the Yakima Nation the right to travel on public highways.
Okay.
And so Cougar Den argued that the state's fuel tax was a burden on their right to travel.
Okay.
Because it was adding a cost to them transporting goods to market on the reservation. And those goods were specifically fuel in this case.
So you can see how the Yakima Nation and Cougar Den are seeing this as like, we have this treaty, right? We have this right to travel on the highway, and this fuel tax is like a barrier in a way to us exercising that, right? And especially when it comes to them, making a living and doing business and things like that.
Right. And so Washington State had their own perspective on this.
Okay.
And so they were basically characterizing this fuel tax as a generally applicable tax on goods.
Okay.
They were saying this is similar to taxes that we impose on other goods that enter the state.
Okay.
And they were saying that it's actually a use tax on possessing fuel in the state, not on the act of transporting fuel.
Okay, so they're making this distinction between use and transportation.
Absolutely, yeah. So their argument was basically that the treaty right to travel in common with others didn't grant tribal members an exemption from these generally applicable economic burdens.
Interesting.
Right. And they were drawing a distinction between what they considered permissible regulations like traffic laws, right, that are designed for public safety and economic burdens like taxes.
Okay.
And so they were saying, look, everyone else has to pay this tax. Why should Cougar Den get a pass just because there are tribal members using the same roads?
Right. So that's their argument.
Yeah. They actually cited Wagnon, a prior Supreme Court case, to support their position that the incidence of the tax had been moved off the reservation. Right. And then finally, they said that the in common with language in the treaty just meant that everyone has equal access to the physical infrastructure of the highways, not that there's a special tax exemption for goods that are being transported.
Okay, so they've built a pretty good case here around, generally applicable tax, equal treatment for all highway users.
Right.
What did Cougar Den do to push back on those points and to try to convince the court that their, treaty protected them?
Yeah. So Cougar Den really focused on the idea that no matter what you call it, this fuel tax is a burden on our treaty protected, right? To transport goods to and from market on public highways. And they characterized it as an importation tax that's specifically targeting the movement of goods into the state. And they're saying that's exactly what the 1855 treaty was supposed to protect.
Right.
And so they're saying that this is basically Washington putting a financial barrier on their ability to engage in trade, which is something the treaty guaranteed them.
Okay.
And they distinguish between the act of acquiring goods, which they conceded could be subject to taxation if it occurred off reservation, and the transportation of those goods. And they said those are two separate things.
Okay.
And they cited a couple cases, Lee and Yakima Indian Nation, to support their argument that a state cannot tax the exercise of a federal treaty. Right. So they're leaning heavily on precedent here.
Right.
And they said that this treaty secured their right to travel for trade without these types of burdens. And they're saying that's especially true within the ceded area, which is this huge amount of land that the Yakima Nation gave to the United States. And they also pointed out some inconsistencies in how the state was applying the tax.
Okay.
They noted that licensed wholesalers who import fuel by other means, like by boat, don't have to pay this tax at the same point of entry.
Interesting.
Right. And so they're saying, well, if this is supposed to be generally applicable, why are there all these exceptions?
Right.
And they even pointed to the fact that the Washington State Supreme Court had interpreted the statute as a tax on transportation.
Okay.
So they're really trying to hit them from all sides, saying this is not what you say. This is really about burdening our ability to move goods.
So you got these two very strong sides with good arguments and good legal precedent on their side.
Right.
Talk testimonies, listeners. I'm sure the questions from the justices were really interesting.
Yeah, there were some really interesting questions.
What were some of the highlights?
So Justice Sotomayor really focused on the state's ability to tax the tribe's purchase of fuel in another state. And she was really getting at the nature of the license requirement and whether this tax was really a burden on their ability to use highways to carry goods from outside Washington.
So she's really focusing on, like, where is the actual taxable event occurring?
Yeah.
Is it really about the highway?
Yeah. Is it really about the movement or is it about something else?
Justice Kagan pressed the state to assume that the tax was generally applicable, but then asked if it could still apply to the Yakima given the treaty.
Okay.
And so she zeroed in on whether the tax was actually a tax on transportation, which everyone was arguing is protected.
Okay.
Justice Gorsuch picked up on the in common with language in the treaty.
Okay.
And he questioned whether it was consistent to interpret that same phrase differently for fishing rights versus highway travel rights.
Interesting. So he's making connections between this case and a lot of other...
Right. And there's a lot of precedent on fishing rights.
Right.
So he's saying, are we going to be consistent here?
Right.
Justice Kavanaugh focused on the historical context of the treaty.
And he really emphasized how much land the Yakima Nation gave up. And he questioned whether the tax was a burden on their ability to bring goods to market, which was something they were promised in the treaty. And he also really focused on the distinction between possession and transportation.
Interesting.
Justice Breyer, as he often does, was raising these hypotheticals about tolls and taxes on other goods like marijuana.
Okay.
And he kept pressing the state's lawyer on whether the statute actually said it was taxing transportation.
Okay.
Justice Alito questioned the basis for distinguishing between regulations that might be permissible under the treaty and taxes, which Cougar Den was saying are not permissible.
Oh, okay.
And so he gave the example of, like, bans on diseased goods.
Right.
And he also wanted to really understand if the taxable event was the possession or the transportation.
Right.
Chief Justice Roberts really focused on whether this was a transportation tax or a possession tax.
Okay.
He used the analogy of apple inspections when apples are coming into the state. And then finally, Justice Ginsburg asked about where the tax is imposed, particularly for things like online purchases and shipments into the state.
So they're really getting granular here in terms of...
Yeah, they're really trying to understand how this works and what the real impact is.
Where this tax is actually hitting and how it's functioning in practice.
And so ultimately, it really came down to this question of, is this fuel tax a burden on the Yakima Nation's treaty right to travel for trade?
Right.
And that's this really difficult balance between state authority to tax and these federally protected treaty rights.
Okay, so we've got the background, we've got the arguments, the questions.
Yeah.
Now it's time for Talk Testimonies, listeners. Our 10th chair segment.
Okay.
If you were the 10th justice on the Supreme Court, how would you have ruled on this case?
So I think I would have sided with the majority in ruling for Cougar Den.
Okay.
I think the thing that really sticks out to me is the language in the 1855 treaty. And this right to travel on public highways that was explicitly given to the Yakima Nation.
Right.
I mean, I understand that the state needs to raise money through taxes.
Sure. But
this particular fuel tax, as applied to Cougar Den transporting fuel to sell on their reservation, really seems to directly go against that treaty, right?
Okay, so it's the direct conflict with the treaty, right, that really stands out to you.
I think that's the most important thing.
Yeah.
And, the state's saying that this is just a generally applicable use tax.
Right.
I think that kind of ignores the history here.
Yeah.
And the specific promises that were made to the Yakima Nation.
Right.
This wasn't just about the physical act of getting from one place to another.
Right.
This was about the tribe's ability to trade and bring their goods to market without facing unfair barriers.
Okay.
And I think the fact that the state applies this tax differently, depending on how the fuel is brought in, also kind of undermines their argument. And then the state's own Supreme Court interpreting the statute as a tax on transportation. I think that's a really key point.
Okay.
States do have the power to tax economic activity off of tribal land.
Right.
But when you have a tax that is triggered specifically by a tribe bringing goods into the state on highways for trade, that seems to really step on the treaty.
Okay.
And I think you have to consider the historical context. The Yakima Nation had this really strong interest in being able to get to markets using these transportation routes. So I would say that the Washington state fuel tax, as it applied to Cougar Den, is not allowed because of that 1855 treaty.
So it's preempted by the treaty.
Yeah.
So really interesting perspective there. I think it really highlights for Talk Testimonies listeners, that constant push and pull between a state's authority and these treaty rights.
Absolutely. It's all about finding that balance, and it's not easy.
And having to take into account the specific facts of each case and the history and all of that.
Yeah. And really understanding the treaty and what it meant at the time and how it applies today.
Well, this has been a really deep dive into this case, I hope, Talk Testimonies listeners. That it sparks some curiosity for you about all the different issues that are implicated here.
Definitely.
Treaty rights and state power and the role of the Supreme Court and all of that. And this is just the beginning.
Right.
Keep thinking, keep learning.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.